At Armas, can you tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you do?
Yeah, as I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more later, but I'm Cuban American. I'm from Miami, and I was raised Roman Catholic, and then I sort of switched over to, or was introduced to white evangelicalism, and then as you can read in my book, I kind of sort of dissect my experiences and in contrast to my upbringing. And then, so I have an MAT and an MDiv from Fuller Theological Seminary. And that's really where all of this sort of began, this work. It was my wrestling with formal, right, theology, and also with my upbringing, which felt very informal, but was still just as deeply formative for me. And that's currently where I speak from and the background, sort of my social location. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, and just in terms of just diving in a little bit deeper, from your reading your book, it's very clear that your upbringing has impacted your spiritual, your theological formation. Um, can you talk a little bit more in depth just about your experience as a Cuban American? How has your identity shaped who you are as a Christian? And then, do you have any words that you want to give as advice to other Christians of color, and how it's important for them to see their identity and their background to shape their Christian identity?
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, being Cuban American, I think, is the primary, aspect of my identity from which I understand the world and also from which I understand faith. And that was actually something that came about as I was, like I said, wrestling through seminary. So much of what was learning from, or so much of how I was introduced to theology, spoke about my culture or Latinx culture, or really any non-white culture, as a sort of contextual theology, right? It was like a
Mm.
lecture in a classroom, or it was just something on the side that we, spoke about. And it was, I speak about this in my book, but I was in a women in church history class, and we were, I had learned about all these incredible women throughout history, but most of them were European women, of course, because that was just sort of the focus when it comes to church history. And
Mhm.
then, so for my final paper, I was like, well, what about Cuban women? What have they done, or what happened in Cuba when it comes to religion? And of course, I had been introduced to that here and there, but I wanted to really look at it from a church history perspective. And that's when I realized so much of, wow, there's so much here. I was obviously studying mujerista theology, which is liberation theology from a Latinx, so women's
Mhm.
perspective. And so yeah, doing so much of this studying, and I'm realizing, like, wait, this should be something that we all learn about, that we all glean from, not
Mhm.
just a lecture in a classroom, right? And that goes for all cultural groups and all of us who are from non-white or non-dominant culture. Our stories deserve a place, just like the rest of the stories that we hear. And so I think for me, just really digging deep into, the history of my people, it wasn't pretty. I was really excited at first, and then, to see how Christianity intersected with Cuba. But of course, the history of colonization and all those things, it
Mhm.
just was not a very, I went in there very naively, and I obviously knew the history of colonization, but I think it really felt very personal for me, particularly as a woman, and particularly, as a Cuban woman. And yeah, and I would say for other folks, with varying cultural backgrounds, I think, it's very important to get deep into the nuances of your people. I know that in many ways, whether it's Asian American people groups, or whether it's Latinx people groups, or, we sort of get lumped into these monolithic categories, but there's something unique about Cuban people, right? There's something
Mm,
unique about your particular group of people. And I think just getting more nuanced is always there's just so much there, you know. I always say this, like even in progressive spaces, you know, we want to talk about like the Latino vote or the Black vote, and that's still like that does nothing for us, you know, because there's so many nuances within that. And so I would say just get as nuanced as you can, because there's so many details that we miss when we look at our people as a monolith.
that's really helpful. Your book that's coming out is called Abuelita Faith. Can you
Great
tell us what do you,
pronunciation.
oh, thank you. Can you tell us what do you mean by an Abuelita theology, Abuelita faith, and then what kind of made you start thinking about that in those sort of terms?
Yeah, so Abuelita theology, I like to say that there's not one Abuelita theology, but there are several Abuelita theologies, because I believe it's very personal, right? It's birthed through just the women, our ancestors who have gone before us, and that's going to look very different for every person. Sometimes people may not know their biological grandmother or, you know, people like that in their families. And so who are your spiritual grandmothers, right? Whose shoulders do you stand on? And of course, it's particularly focused on women, and women of color. And so one big thing for me when it comes to Abuelita theology is just sort of this idea of survival. And so when I investigate the stories in scripture, I want to look at, you know, so many of these women in the Bible and so many women throughout history and so many of our grandmothers and our ancestors, they were just trying to survive, right? Like they were just like
Mm,
trying to like, I mean, we look at the story of Ruth and Naomi, and you know that story is so like romanticized, but in many ways like they were just trying to secure their future, you know. Like Naomi was like, hey Ruth, go over there, do this because you need to remarry, because we need to eat tomorrow, and we need to, you know, like we need to be alive in 10 years or whatever, you know. Obviously considering the patriarchal context or whatever. So I'm just sort of investigating this idea of survival, and kind of looking at survival as a holy endeavor, right? Like
mm,
survival in and of itself is sacred. And we see that because, I mean, God blesses so much of these stories that for us may be kind of scandalous, right? The
mm,
story of Tamar, who dresses up as a prostitute, right, and sleeps with her father-in-law, and we're like, oh yeah, you know, we kind of say that story in passing, but if you really look at it, and Tamar is in the genealogy of Jesus, you know, her story, she's blessed, you know, she's called righteous for what she did, you know. And of course, there's many interpretations to that, but still, it's just this idea that that survival is sacred and survival is holy, and so that's sort of I would say part of what I understand Abuelita theology to be. It's a theology of survival, strength, resistance, and persistence, you know, like my book title says, because so many of these women just persist and they resist. And yeah, and they do what's best for themselves, their communities, and in response to their God, which I think is just so beautiful. And it's not just biblical women, but it's the story of my grandmother, and it's the story of so many of our grandmothers, particularly those of us who are people of color, who are grandparents immigrated or, you know, have had to undergo and live through so many different life circumstances. So yeah, it's a little bit of what Abuelita theology
mm.
is.
That's awesome. Um, yeah, and just based off that too, I mean, you mentioned your own grandmother. Were there other people, you know, including your grandmother, that really inspired you to write this book? And what was it specifically about them? You know, you mentioned things like persistence and survival. Were just other kind of formative things in your life, your upbringing, that really shaped you to, you know, to write a book like this?
Yeah, well, definitely, obviously, my grandmother, as you mentioned, obviously, the women in the Bible. You know, as I mentioned the story of Ruth and Naomi, but I just remember reading that story as I'm reading it through, you know, a mujerista lens. And I will say, mujerista theology was very inspirational for me. Ada Maria Sassi Diaz, which is the mother of mujerista theology, she's a Cuban, also Cuban theologian. She passed away in 2012, but so she was very influential for me. But as I'm, reading through the lens of Mujerista theology and I'm thinking about my grandmother and I'm reading the story of Ruth and Naomi and I'm thinking, this is my grandmother's story, like she just had to like figure it out. And, her husband died and it was just, there were so many similarities. And then I'm reading through again through church history and there's so many women and so many things that women did, throughout history. Like I mentioned earlier, the Cuban women during the revolution, I mean, they were instrumental behind the scenes, against the right-wing dictator before Castro. They were instrumental in getting him out of there. And many of them were housewives and many of them were Christians, right? And they used church as a place to organize and, start these movements. And the same is true, for the civil rights movement. I'm reading the story of Joanne Robinson and how essentially it was her who started, the Montgomery bus boycott, which is sort of the catalyst, the big movement of the civil rights movement. But these are not the stories that we often hear. We hear, of course, MLK Jr. and as we should, but we don't hear as much about the Joanne Robinsons, and we don't hear as much about the underground Cuban women who did so much for the movement before the revolution. And we don't hear so much about the Rizbas, in scripture who protested at her son's grave, her son's unjust murders, and which brought rain and which got the attention of the king. These aren't the stories. We love the stories of the David and the Goliath is, but not so much the stories of the Rizbas. And so that was something very important for me to highlight in this book, and something that I thought, man, there's a lot here. And it starts with just our quote unquote informal, uneducated, poor in many ways, grandmothers who, and again, grandmothers, that's a very broad term, spiritual grandmothers, but, these women that are poor, uneducated, but they're theologians and they're theologizing and they're resisting and they're persisting. I think of the Canaanite mother, who goes up to Jesus and she says like the most theologically like explosive statement that no one else had understood. Like, you are the Son of God, and no one else had said anything like that, I think it's the chapter before or the chapter after that Jesus tells her, like, you have great faith. I think it was either before or right after he had just told his disciples, you have no faith, So it's like, how is this woman who is triply marginalized, who no one would consider a theologian, theologizing this way, right? So anyway, this also answers your last question. What is Abuelita theology? I think that has a lot to do with it too. But yeah, so all of those women were so inspirational for me, and realizing, oh, there's a lot here. Like, this isn't just some little side thing. This can be a book. And it became a book. So
that's awesome. As you mentioned a little bit about your own personal story of like looking a little bit deeper into your Cuban heritage, you've mentioned there's lots of kind of ugliness of colonialism. And as you read your book, it's definitely clear that an integral part of Abuelita theology is recognizing and seeing the damaging impacts of colonialism, and even what does it look like to decolonize one's own theology. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important for us to, see, the ugliness of colonialism, the lasting impacts of it, and can you kind of even provide some contemporary examples of where we still see kind of colonialism's long shadow still affecting the way we do theology, the way we think about Christian living, and so on?
Yeah, well, to answer the last part of your question, I think that kind of just goes back to this idea of like, well, what's dominant culture, what's normalized, right? And what's contextual and what's on the side. And I think that is a byproduct of colonialism, is that anything that is not Western European, is not dominant, right? Is just something, an extra little thing that you can learn on the side. But yeah, I think that a huge part, like you mentioned, of my book is just sort of, or at least I start off with, explaining this idea or what I mean by decolonizing our faith, and also just colonialism in general. And yeah, so I want to start by saying that Western ways of being are not necessarily bad or wrong. they just have been for so long like the way, the world order of how we are to understand or know things, right? I talk a lot about knowledge in the beginning of my book, and what is knowledge and who gets to say what knowledge is. And so I look at colonialism from that aspect. There's so many aspects that you can look at it, capitalism and whatever, so many things. But I look at it through sort of this idea of knowledge, and who is wise and what is wisdom, is our excuse me, are our grandmothers, those who are not Western educated, are they not knowledgeable, right? Or what do they know? Are they able to articulate their own thoughts about God? And I think that what colonialism has done is ripped so many of our poor, quote unquote, uneducated ancestors and grandmothers and all of those people, has sort of ripped them from agency, because their knowledge is not quote unquote Western, and there's not, it's not formulated by Western ideals. And so that's why I like to look at theology from just non-Western ways of looking at theology. And so I argue that theology is sowing and theology is dancing, because for so long that was a form of connecting with the divine. That was a way, a spiritual thing. And we see this in the Bible, right? I mean, that's why I bring up Tabitha's story, or Miriam, how she led her people in dance as a form of worship, and all these ways that they're not, Western ways of knowing about God, or, spiritualizing, or whatever you want to call it. So that's kind of how the angle that I take when it comes to, colonization, the effects of colonization, particularly obviously Christian, and in how we view just people on the margins, right? That there's not much that we can learn from them because, like I said, they're not educated, or because, whatever, because they're just trying to survive. Whereas for me, survival is the greatest, there is so much to learn from survival. It's not a just, but it's, the crux of what we can learn about God through survival.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, actually that jumps right into my next question. What happens when we, to our theology, to our faith, when we don't learn from women from the margins? Like, what are we missing out? What are things that we, if Paul talks about the body of Christ needing one another, all the parts needing all the members of the body, like what are we,
Right.
what arm are we missing? What ear are we
Yeah.
missing when we don't learn from the women on the margins?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, we're missing, I think, the bulk of it. There's so much. And I think because that is so much of what we read in scripture, so many of the stories in the Bible are stories of marginalized people. So it's one of those things that when we nowadays, refuse, or whatever word you want to use, to learn from folks, from particularly women, my book focuses on women. So learning particularly from women on the margins, women of color, I think that there's a whole aspect of God that we are missing, of knowing about, right? Because women, as I argue in my book, like women carry this sacred wisdom within their bodies. Women bring life and give forth the life, and there's just so many things that we can glean from women who are surviving, ingenuity and creativity, and just so many beautiful and hard things, which I think they tell us so much and give us such a full picture of who God is. I like to say that the image of God is not just individual, but collective. And so we get a full, when all of us, together, when all people are not just represented, but, are speaking into who God is, or just, articulating or theologizing, like that's when we get a full picture of the image of God. Because yes, we each individually represent God, but I think also collectively as our own people groups and genders and all those things. So anyway, yeah, I think that we just miss so much about God, and to get a fuller picture of who God is, and to know God more intimately, and to know different aspects of God. again, how theology is embodied, how we do theology, through with our hands, all these
Mm.
things that we wouldn't learn if we're not learning from people, particularly women on the margins.
And then, what kind of practical advice would you give, especially for Christians in the US, to, begin on their journey to try to, bring women of color, no longer keeping them kind of as elective or on the margins, but really start to bring them closer to the center of their own theology, their faith? What are some practical steps that you would counsel Christians to be able to do that?
Yeah, well, I would say, learn from your grandmothers, right? Learn from your ancestors. Get to know who your ancestors are. Like, what group of people do you come from? In what ways did they connect with the divine? And of course, as Christians, many people are afraid of, oh, but it wasn't Christian, or, but if we believe that God is in everything, and if we believe all those things about God, then there's stuff that we can learn, right, from all people. It might not be exactly, our Christian belief, but we can still learn from people. We can still learn from the ways that people, just connected spiritually. I think of one example is I come, my part of my ancestry are the Taino people from Cuba, and they're the indigenous people there. And there's so many things that as I was doing research on the Taino people and learning about their indigenous culture, and there were so many beautiful lessons to learn and so many, beautiful things to glean from. And one, sort of just funny thing, when I was little, my grandma and I used to always find little lizard eggs, and we loved, these lizard eggs. And that was such a spiritual moment for us, finding these lizard eggs, and we would take care of them and make sure that predators wouldn't come. And it was such a bonding moment for me and my grandmother. And it was beautiful. I mean, we got to connect with creation, and we got to connect, and talk about God through creation. And then I come to find out that lizards are sacred for the Taino people. And it was just a nice little connection to know that, God cares about, all the creatures of the earth. And yeah, so I think it's just, what can we learn from our ancestors, and what can we learn from our grandmothers, and what can we learn from all peoples of the earth? If we believe that God really is who God says God is, then, there is so much to learn from plants and from animals, and from those who may not look like us, or even just know, quote unquote, have knowledge in the way that we have knowledge, or understand the world in the way that we understand the world.
Hmm. Can you also touch on, any the importance of friendship in terms of being able to, one, recognize your own background, having other people as well as they are trying to center women of color, having friendships as well. Can you talk about like how friendship might be an important aspect of that too?
Yeah. Well, it's Brian Stevenson that talks about proximity, right? And how we need to be proximate, to people, and proximate to pain, and proximate to these things in order to understand other people's struggles. And I think particularly those of us with varying levels of privilege, even as a Cuban woman, I'm educated, and I carry varying levels of privilege. And so, how am I proximate? And yeah, friendship is a way to be proximate. So much of Abuelita theology is, as I mentioned, it's informal, but it happens around the table. It happens over a cup of coffee. It happens while you're mopping the floor and talking about the struggles of life. And those are all things centered on friendship, and centered on belongingness to one another. And so, even going back to what I was just saying, I think it's understanding that we have a sacred belongingness to all humans, and all creatures of the earth, all created things, that we have a sacred belongingness. And so I think really leaning into that sacred belongingness as friends, in being proximate, and all those things that we can do.
That's great. Well, that's all the questions I have for you. Is there anything else that you wanted to add just about this book, just things that you've been thinking about as well? Future book ideas too, anything like that?
Yeah, actually, I did sign a 2-book deal, so there will be a second book coming out. Yeah. So,
okay.
Yeah, I am pregnant right now though, so I'm taking a little bit of time it's a little slower process, but yeah. So, So I'll be doing that, and that'll be out next year. So yeah, I
Awesome.
look forward to sharing more.
Awesome. And congrats on the pregnancy as
Thank
well.
you. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your time. Thanks
Yeah,
for just talking a bit about who you are and the work you're doing in this book. And yeah, we'll be looking forward to the next book as well.
great. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. And
All
yeah,
right.
thank you for this chat.
Yep. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.